The cold came early that year in the mountains of central Montana, the kind that arrived not gradually but all at once, as if the season had made a decision overnight and saw no reason to apologize for it. By the first week of October, the high trails were already buried under 14 inches of new snow, and the lower passes had glazed over with a sheet of ice so smooth and treacherous that even the wildlife seemed to think twice before crossing it. The park had gone quiet in the way remote places go quiet in winter, not peacefully, not restfully, but with a particular weight, a kind of held breath, as if the land itself was waiting for something it couldn't name. Nora Callahan had been a park ranger in the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness for 11 years. She knew this silence the way she knew the lines of her own hands. She had grown up just south of the park boundary, in a town so small it had one church and no stoplight, raised by a father who surveyed land for a living and a mother who cataloged wildflowers for a university press. Both of them had given her the same gift without knowing it, the ability to look at a landscape and understand that it was always saying something, that you only had to slow down long enough to listen. She was 38 now, lean and deliberate in her movements, with the kind of quiet authority that came not from rank, but from years of making good decisions alone in places where no one was watching. She had never wanted a desk job, had never wanted anything that put a ceiling above her head during daylight hours. Her small cabin at the edge of the ranger station's compound was warm enough in winter and cool enough in summer, and that, as far as she was concerned, was all a home needed to be. That October morning, she was running her standard patrol along the Northern Ridge Circuit, a 12-mile loop she could have walked in her sleep. The sky was the particular blue-white of high-altitude cold, empty of clouds, brutal in its clarity. Her breath came out in visible puffs. Her boots crunched a steady rhythm into the packed snow. She checked trail markers, documented snowpack depth at 3 survey stations, photographed a section of trail erosion near the creek crossing, and radioed her position to dispatch at the top of every hour. Everything was routine. Everything was as it should be. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had been walking for roughly 4 hours when she came around the shoulder of a ridge she had crossed perhaps 200 times and stopped so abruptly that her boots skidded an inch on the ice beneath the snow. She stood very still, her eyes moving across the landscape ahead, trying to understand what had snagged her attention. At first she saw nothing wrong. The slope fell away from her in a broad curve toward a hollow she knew was there, a natural depression between 2 ridges where wind tended to pile snow into deep drifts in winter and where, in summer, a small meadow filled with wild columbine and blue flax. She had eaten lunch there many times. She knew it, but she didn't know the mountain. She looked again, more carefully this time, the way her father had taught her to look at land surveys, not searching for what should be there, but noticing what was. And that was when she saw it. At the far edge of the hollow, where the east ridge met the slope in a long shadow line, there was a formation that didn't belong. Not a rock formation, not a fallen tree, not a drift sculpted by wind. Something vertical, something that caught the angle of morning light differently from everything around it, with a faint shadow geometry that suggested a straight line, and straight lines almost never occurred naturally this far into the backcountry. She stood looking at it for a full 2 minutes before she moved toward it. She was not a person who rushed toward things she didn't understand. That was how people got hurt in the wilderness, and she had seen enough of that in 11 years to know better. She descended into the hollow carefully, keeping her weight low on the steeper sections, testing the snow before committing her steps. The cold pressed in from all sides. The shadow in the east ridge grew as she approached, and the thing she had seen from above began to take shape. It was stone. Not loose stone, not a natural outcropping, but worked stone, cut and stacked with intention. A wall. She stopped again, 30 yards out, and stood with her gloved hands in her pockets, and just looked. The wall was mostly buried. Snow had piled against it from the east side until it was nearly indistinguishable from the slope itself. But the top few feet were visible where the wind had scoured the surface clean, and what was visible was unmistakably constructed. Mortar courses. A slight inward lean that suggested load-bearing design. And at the near end, where the wall turned and disappeared into the ridge, something that might have been a door frame. She pulled out her radio and checked in with dispatch. Running a little longer on the North Circuit, she said. Found a structural anomaly at the East Hollow on the ridge section. Going to document before I head back. The dispatcher, young Tommy Reardon, who still got excited about almost everything, asked if she needed backup. She said no. She said she'd be careful. Then she put the radio away and walked toward the wall. Up close, it was more substantial than it had looked from a distance. The stonework was old, genuinely old. Not the kind of old that meant 40 years, but the kind that meant someone had built this before anyone currently alive had been born. The mortar between the courses had been mixed with something that gave it a reddish tint, and sections of it had crumbled and been repacked. She could see the layers of repair, decades of it, as if someone had been maintaining the structure at intervals over a very long time. She ran a gloved finger along one of the courses and felt the stone give slightly under pressure in one spot, not structurally loose, but softened, as if the rock itself had been absorbing moisture through a century or more of Montana winters. She circled the structure slowly. What she had taken from above for a wall was the front face of something much larger. The building, and it was undeniably a building. She could see that now was built directly into the ridge, using the natural rock of the mountain as its back and side walls. Only the front face and part of the south face had been constructed. The rest of the structure was the mountain itself. Whoever had built this had chosen the location with care, tucking the structure into the ridge so that from almost any angle above, it would be invisible. You would have to come down into the hollow, to a specific point on the west approach, in a specific quality of light, to see it at all. The door frame she had noticed from above turned out to be exactly that. The door itself was gone timber, probably, long since rotted away, but the stone arch above it was intact, low and thick, and beyond it was darkness and a smell she couldn't immediately name. Not rot, not mold, something mineral, something cold and sealed and ancient. She took out her flashlight and turned it on. The beam hit a staircase. Not a wooden stair, not a simple stone step down to a root cellar. A spiral staircase, cut from the living rock of the mountain, descending in a tight helix into the dark below. The steps were narrow 12, maybe 13 inches wide and worn smooth in the center from use. Real use. Long use. The kind of wear that accumulated over decades of the same feet, in the same boots, descending the same path. She counted 11 visible steps before the spiral carried them out of her flashlight's reach, which meant the staircase went considerably deeper than a standard cellar. She stood at the top for a long moment. Her training said document and call it in. Her instincts said document and call it in. She took photographs of the entrance, the arch, the first several steps, and the overall exterior of the structure from 4 different angles. She noted the GPS coordinates and sent them to her personal device as a backup. She radioed dispatch again and gave the location with more precision this time, describing what she had found in careful, factual language. Tommy Reardon, to his credit, had gone very quiet on the other end by the time she finished. "That's outside any mapped structure in this sector," he said. "I know. Do you want me to pull the historical surveys?" "Yes. Everything going back as far as we have. And flag it for the supervisor. I'm going to do a surface documentation pass and then wait for direction." She spent the next 40 minutes outside, cataloging everything she could observe without entering. The exterior stonework, the orientation of the structure relative to the ridge and the cardinal directions, the depth of the snowpack against the walls, which told her how long it had been since anyone had cleared the entrance, months at minimum, possibly a full winter. She found no tracks in the snow around the structure, other than her own. She found what appeared to be a second, much smaller opening on the south face, sealed with stone that had been mortared in place at some point more recently than the original construction. She could tell, because the mortar color was slightly different, and the stones filling the opening were irregularly shaped, clearly not cut to fit. Someone had blocked it deliberately. When she had documented everything she could reach from the surface, she sat on a snow-cleared section of the south wall and ate the sandwich she had packed that morning and thought about the staircase. She had been a ranger for 11 years. In that time, she had found 3 unmarked graves, 2 illegal mining operations, a Depression-era homestead so completely buried by pine growth that only the chimney was visible from above, and once, memorably, a cache of Civil War-era cavalry equipment in a rockfall cave that had turned out to be a legitimate historical artifact of considerable academic interest. She had learned that the mountains kept secrets not by intention, but by indifference. They simply went on being mountains, and the things people left in them went on being left, until someone walked the right path in the right light and happened to look at the right angle. But this was different from all of those. The difference was the staircase. The staircase was not the relic of something surface level that had been forgotten. The staircase went down. It went into the mountain, deep enough that her flashlight hadn't found the bottom. And it had been used. Worn smooth. Maintained. The structure above it had been maintained too. She could see that in the layered mortar repairs. Someone had been coming here for a very long time and descending those stairs. Her radio crackled. It was her supervisor, Dan Hartley, 10 years her senior, a careful man who measured his words the way a surveyor measured land, precisely and without sentiment. Nora, I pulled the surveys. You're not going to find it on any of them. I know. Township records either. There's no registered structure in that quadrant. Never has been, as far back as the county has records. Which goes back to 1889 for the county. Territorial records before that are fragmentary. We've got some survey maps from the 1870s that cover portions of this area, but they're rough. This section was marked as unmapped terrain. Nora looked up at the ridge. Unmapped terrain. In 1870, that had been a practical description. The surveyors had their own pressures and limitations, and a remote mountain hollow with no mineral claims and no accessible grazing land would have merited exactly the attention it had received, which was none. I'm going to go in, she said. A pause. Protocol says we send a team. Protocol says I exercise judgment on safety hazards in real time. The structure is sound on the exterior. There's no indication of instability. I'm going in for a preliminary safety assessment, and I'll radio updates every 5 minutes. Another pause, longer. Every 3 minutes. Every 4. She heard something that might have been a suppressed laugh. Fine. 4. And Nora, be careful. She put the radio in her vest pocket where she could reach it without looking and turned the flashlight back on and descended into the mountain. The steps were slick from cold, but not from ice. The interior temperature was warmer than outside. The mountain itself acting as insulation, keeping the air inside the stairwell at something close to the temperature of the surrounding rock. She counted as she went. 13 steps to the first full rotation of the spiral. Another 13 to the second. She was deeper than any standard basement or root cellar by the time she reached the third rotation, and still the stairs continued. The walls of the stairwell were the native rock of the mountain, smoothed in places where hands had touched them over years of passage, rough and raw where they hadn't. There was no timber, no brick, nothing imported. Everything was stone and mountain. At the fourth rotation, she reached the bottom. She stopped on the last step and held her flashlight steady and looked at what the mountain contained. The chamber was large. Not enormous, not a cavern in any natural sense, but a human-scale space of considerable size, perhaps 40 feet long and 20 wide, its ceiling the underside of the native rock, uneven and raw, but high enough that she could stand without ducking. The floor had been leveled. She could see the tool marks where someone had worked at the stone to create a flat surface, patient and meticulous work, the kind that took months, not days. The walls were partly natural rock, partly the same worked stone from the exterior, fitted into gaps in the mountain's own structure to create an enclosed space that was more than a cave, but less than a built room, a collaboration between what the mountain offered and what a builder's hands had shaped. And the chamber was not empty. Along the right-hand wall, running most of its length, were shelves cut directly into the rock. Not added shelves, not timber brackets, but recesses chiseled into the stone itself, in a series of uniform dimensions, as if someone had spent a great deal of time planning the layout before they began cutting. The shelves were filled. She couldn't tell with what from the doorway the contents were wrapped, most of them, in material that had darkened with age but had not rotted, something treated, something that had survived whatever the mountain's climate had done to it over the years. But the shapes were varied. Some things were flat and rectangular, others cylindrical, others irregular and substantial in a way that suggested weight, real weight, something dense. In the center of the chamber, on the leveled floor, was a single piece of furniture. A table, solid stone, built the same way everything else here had been built from what the mountain offered, shaped by what a builder knew. On the table were two objects. The first was a book, or something that had once been a book, its cover dark with age, its pages compressed by time into a rigid block. The second was a small metal box, the kind that might have held fishing flies or small tools, except that it was sealed with a clasp that had been soldered shut. Nora Callahan stood on the bottom step of the spiral staircase and looked at all of this and understood that she was the first person who had stood in this chamber in a very long time. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. The cold-preserved stillness of the air held no trace of recent breath, no scent of recent presence. Whatever was sealed in this room had been sealed for years, possibly decades, possibly much longer. She radioed Hartley. Her voice was steady. That was the thing she was most proud of in the account she gave him, that her voice was completely steady. What followed was what always followed when something impossible turned out to be real. There were phone calls, and then there were more phone calls. There were vehicles on a road that didn't officially exist, approaching a hollow that wasn't on any map, carrying people who came prepared for something routine and found something that was very much not. There were archaeologists, eventually, and historians, and a man from the State Historical Society who drove 4 hours in a snowstorm because he couldn't wait until the roads were clear. There were photographs and measurements and careful, exacting documentation of every surface in the chamber. And there was the question that no one could answer in those first days, the question that rose above all the practical concerns and the professional excitement and the careful language of official assessment. The question that Nora asked herself every night for a week while she waited for the historians to tell her what they had found. Who had built this? And why had they put something here that they sealed so carefully, so deeply, so permanently, inside a mountain? The answer, when it began to emerge, was stranger and more human than anyone had anticipated. The book on the table stabilized by a conservator flown in from Missoula, its pages separated with the patience of someone defusing something irreplaceable, turned out to be a journal. Not a personal diary in the usual sense. A record, written in a precise, educated hand that shifted between English and what a linguist later identified as a form of archaic Scots Gaelic. The earliest legible dates in the journal placed its beginning sometime in the 1840s. The writers signed their entries with initials only, C.M.F. The entries described a journey. Not a journey through geography, though there was that two descriptions of terrain that matched this corner of Montana with a specificity that left little doubt about location. But the journey being described was of another kind. C.M.F. wrote about a search, conducted over many years, for a place that would endure. A place that the world's instability, its violence and cupidity and carelessness, could not reach. A place where certain things could be kept safe. What things? The journal didn't immediately say. The writer was not given to direct statement. They circled their subject the way a cautious person circles something they are not sure they can trust, approaching from different angles, testing the ground before committing. Nora read the transcribed portions of the journal on the 7th night after the discovery, sitting at her kitchen table with a mug of tea going cold beside her. She read with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered. And partway through the 3rd page of the transcript, she set it down and sat very still for a moment. Then she drove back to the hollow in the dark. She parked where the road ended and walked the rest of the way by flashlight, down into the hollow, through the stone arch, and down the spiral staircase. The conservators and archaeologists were gone for the night. The chamber was sealed with a padlock the Historical Society had installed, and she had a key because she was the site warden and because Hartley had insisted someone with her level of judgment hold a copy. She unlocked the chamber and went in and stood in front of the shelves. The wrapped objects were still in place. Nothing had been moved, yet protocol required a full documentation inventory before anything was disturbed. She stood in front of the nearest shelf and looked at the shapes. Flat and rectangular, mostly. The size and proportion of paintings. The cylindrical ones at the far end, the width and length of a scroll case, or of something rolled and protected. She went back upstairs and drove home and called the archaeologist leading the assessment, a woman named Dr. Priya Suresh from the University of Montana, who answered on the 2nd ring because, as she would later say, she had been waiting for something to break on this case, and she had developed a feeling about Nora Callahan. The journal, Nora said. The section where C.M.F. talks about what's being protected. I want to know what the full translation says. Dr. Suresh was quiet for a moment. We're still working on parts of it. The Gaelic sections are difficult. The parts you have. Another pause. Nora, We're going to have a full briefing on Monday. It's Thursday night, and I'm the site warden, and I need to know what I'm protecting." Suresh sighed, the sigh of someone who recognized a losing position. She heard papers being moved. Then the archaeologist read to her from her working notes, haltingly, filling in gaps with best guesses where the translation was uncertain. C.M.F. had written about beauty. That was the word the journal returned to again and again. In both languages, beauty not as an aesthetic preference, but as a moral category, a thing that had obligations attached to it, a thing that demanded protection because its loss was not merely sad, but was a kind of wound inflicted on everyone who would never see it. C.M.F. had written that beauty was what people made when they were trying to say something that language couldn't hold, that art was the evidence of the human effort to reach towards something larger than a single life, and that there were forces in the world not evil in any supernatural sense, just human greed and human blindness, and the plain destructive momentum of wars and upheavals that would consume that evidence without a second thought. So C.M.F. had built a vault, not a bank vault, not a museum, a vault inside a mountain in the unmapped terrain of what would become Montana, built with their own hands over years of labor, and filled with things they believed deserved to survive the century they were living through. Nora sat with the phone against her ear and listened to Suresh read, and felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Not excitement, exactly. Not the professional satisfaction of a significant find. Something quieter than that, and larger. "What's in the shelves, Priya?" she asked when Suresh paused. The archaeologist was quiet for 3 full seconds. "We don't know yet. We haven't opened anything. But you have a sense. We have shapes and weights. The flat rectangular objects are consistent with framed canvases wrapped for transport. The cylindrical ones are consistent with rolled documents or maps. There are others that are irregular we genuinely can't say without opening them." "Canvases," Nora said. "I said consistent with." "How many?" 43 visible on the shelves. There may be more in the recessed area at the back that we haven't fully documented yet." 43. Nora looked at the transcript in her hand, at C.M.F's careful, archaic sentences about beauty and obligation and the necessity of preservation. "Where did they come from?" she asked. "If they're what you think they might be." "That," Suresh said quietly, "is the question that's going to keep me awake for the foreseeable future. And I suspect you too." She wasn't wrong. The assessment process that followed was meticulous and slow, the way real archaeological work always is when it's done properly. The chamber was photographed in its entirety before a single object was touched. Temperature and humidity were logged every 6 hours. Every wrapped object was numbered and mapped in its position on the shelves before anyone laid hands on it. Suresh ran her team with the focused precision of someone who understood that what was done now couldn't be undone, and that the record they created in these first days would matter for a very long time. Nora was present for most of it. Hartley had assigned her as the park's official site liaison, which meant she had legitimate reason to be there every day and could watch the work unfold without anyone questioning her presence. She learned the rhythms of the conservators and the archaeologists, when they were focused and when they would welcome a question, who liked to talk through what they were observing and who needed quiet to think. She made herself useful and unobtrusive and paid close attention to everything. On the 4th day, Dr. Suresh opened the first of the wrapped objects. Nora was standing 6 feet away when it happened. The wrapping material, which turned out to be oilcloth, treated with something that a textile conservator later identified as a rendered animal fat mixed with pine resin, a combination that had created a seal against moisture with remarkable effectiveness, came away in careful pieces. Suresh cutting the outer bindings with a conservation blade and peeling the layers back with the unhurried patience of someone who had done this before and knew there was no version of this moment that could be improved by hurry. What was underneath was a painting. The dimensions were roughly 2 feet by 3. The subject was a woman, painted in a style that Nora recognized even from her limited art education as belonging to a very old tradition Renaissance, or close to it, though she couldn't have said which period precisely. The woman was seated, her hands in her lap, looking not at the painter but slightly to the left, at something outside the frame, her expression carrying the particular quality of inwardness that the great portraitist had understood, that certain faces turned inward even in company, and that this inwardness was not absence, but its opposite, a fullness that simply didn't require an audience. The colors were extraordinary, not faded, not dulled. The oilcloth and the resin and the cold and the sealed air of the mountain had done together what no museum storage had managed to do, had preserved the painting in something close to the condition it had left its maker's hands. The ochre and sienna of the background, the blue of the woman's sleeve, the precise, luminous rendering of the light on her hands. Suresh set down her blade. For a moment, no one in the chamber spoke. Then the art historian who had been brought in as a consultant, a lean, sharp-faced man named Professor Edward Galloway, who had flown in from Chicago and had been skeptical of the whole enterprise until approximately this moment, took 3 steps forward and stopped. He stared at the painting. His face went through several things in rapid succession that Nora couldn't quite read, and then he said something under his breath in Italian that she didn't understand, and then he said, in English, very quietly, "I need everyone to step back from that canvas." Nobody moved. "Please," Galloway said. "Step back." They stepped back. Galloway approached the painting alone and looked at it for a very long time. He put on his magnification lenses and looked at it some more. He looked at the back, at the stretcher bars and the canvas material and the ground layer visible at the edges. He looked at the brushwork in the lower right corner with an intensity that seemed to exclude everything else in the room. Then he straightened up and took off his magnification lenses and looked at Suresh. "I need to make some calls," he said. The calls Galloway made that night, and the following morning set in motion a sequence of events that would take months to fully unfold. He called colleagues in Chicago and New York and London. He described, carefully and with the caution of a man who understood what it meant to make a claim that couldn't be supported, what he had seen. He asked questions. He sent photographs through an encrypted channel to 3 different authentication specialists in 3 different countries. He also, because he was a thorough man, began looking into the history of the painting. What he found and communicated to Suresh and to Nora in a meeting at the ranger station on the 6th day, seated at Hartley's conference table with coffee that no one was drinking, was the beginning of an answer to C.M.F.'s question, the one that the journal had never directly asked but that every page of it implied. The painting appeared to match, in every observable characteristic, a work that had been documented in a Scottish private collection in the 1830s. A portrait attributed to a Flemish master of the late 15th century that had been purchased by a Scottish landowner named Charles Munro Finlay and had hung in his family's estate in the Highlands for 3 generations before disappearing from the historical record sometime in the mid-19th century. The family itself had dispersed. The estate had been sold during the Highland clearances. What had become of the collection, no one had ever established. Charles Munro Finlay. C.M.F. Nora sat with that for a moment. A man from the Scottish Highlands, watching his world come apart around him during one of the most devastating forced displacement events in British history, had brought his family's most precious possessions to the most remote place he could find and had sealed them into a mountain. "There's more," Galloway said. He opened his laptop. "The inventory I've started to compile from the visible objects in the chamber, cross-referenced with the journal entries that are translatable, suggests this isn't just Finlay's personal collection. Some of the descriptions in the journal, the ones where C.M.F. is writing about specific objects, their history, where they came from, they match documented losses from other collections, other families, other dispersals. The clearances displaced thousands of people. Many of them lost everything. But some of them, it seems, may have entrusted what they couldn't carry to a man who was building a place where such things could wait." Suresh leaned forward. He was collecting on behalf of others? Preserving. On behalf of people who had nowhere else to put what mattered to them. The room was quiet for a moment. "How many objects are we talking about?" Nora asked. "We haven't finished the inventory, but the journal mentions 47 specific items. The shelves hold at least 43 visible pieces. The recessed area at the back of the chamber, which we haven't fully accessed, yet may hold more." Nora thought about the spiral staircase, the worn smooth centers of the steps, the decades of careful mortar repairs on the exterior walls, the blocked second entrance that someone had sealed with deliberately mismatched stone. "He came back," she said, "after he built it. He came back, for years, maybe for the rest of his life." Galloway nodded. The journal entries span from the 1840s to what appears to be the early 1880s. The handwriting changes significantly in the later entries' age, most likely. The last entry is incomplete. It ends mid-sentence. No one said anything for a moment. Whatever's in that chamber, Nora said. It's been waiting for 140 years. Galloway closed his laptop. Give or take. Yes. The full inventory took 3 weeks. There were 47 objects in the chamber, matching precisely the number mentioned in the journal. 43 were on the visible shelves. 4 more were in the recessed area at the back, wrapped more heavily than the others, in a double layer of oilcloth with an additional binding of waxed linen, as if whoever had placed them had known they would be last to be found and had given them extra protection against the weight. The authentication process was complex and slow and conducted with a rigorousness that Galloway insisted on, and that Suresh supported, and that occasionally frustrated the people from the State Historical Society who wanted answers faster than evidence permitted. Every object was examined by multiple specialists. Every claim was documented and cross-referenced and documented again. The chain of evidence had to be unimpeachable, Galloway said, because what they were establishing was not just the identity of the objects, but their provenance, where they had come from, who had owned them, what had happened to them, and provenance mattered enormously, both historically and legally. What emerged from those 3 weeks was something that no one involved had fully anticipated, not even Galloway, who had been in the business of evaluating significant art and artifacts for 30 years and thought he had developed reasonable expectations about what significant discoveries looked like. 31 of the 47 objects were paintings. Of those 31, 14 were attributable with high confidence to named artists, and of those 14, 6 were attributable to masters of the Flemish and Dutch and Italian Renaissance traditions, painters whose authenticated works were known by count, tracked by scholars worldwide, documented in the great catalogs of art history. Several of the paintings in the chamber matched descriptions of works that had last been documented in the 1840s and 1850s, vanishing from the record at precisely the time when the Highland clearances were forcing their owners to abandon their estates. 9 of the objects were works on paper drawings, prints. One item that turned out to be an illuminated manuscript page of extraordinary condition, preserved so completely by the oilcloth and the mountain air that the gold leaf in its borders still caught light the way it had when someone had applied it, perhaps in the 12th century. 4 were sculptures, small, portable, the kind of objects a person could carry at need, across difficult terrain, without help. 2 of them were bronze, cast in the late medieval period. 2 were carved ivory, older than the bronze pieces by perhaps 2 centuries, their surface details still sharp enough to read without magnification. The remaining 3 objects were in the category that Galloway had labeled, with the dry precision of a man who had learned not to allow his own excitement to colonize his professional language, documentary materials of significant historical interest. These were bundles of papers, sealed in waxed linen and then in oilcloth, containing correspondence, property records, and in one case what appeared to be a series of agreements between multiple Scottish families entrusting specified objects to C.M.F.'s care, written in the formal legal language of the period and signed by parties who could, with historical research, be identified. C.M.F. had not acted alone. He had not simply saved his own family's treasures. He had been trusted by others, by families who knew they were losing everything and who had chosen, rather than watch their most precious possessions disappear into the hands of creditors or be scattered by displacement, to give them to a man they believed would protect them. And he had, for 140 years, inside a hollow mountain in the unmapped terrain of central Montana, Charles Monroe Finley had kept his word. The question of value, the kind with a $sign in front of it, was one that Nora had been deliberately avoiding, not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't the part that had captured her. She was not a person who thought about money as a primary category. She thought about places and time and the things that persisted. But the question was unavoidable, because the people who came to assess the chamber, the experts and the officials, and eventually the legal representatives of the State Historical Society and the federal agency with jurisdiction over the park, all wanted to know, and their wanting to know made the question real. Galloway gave his preliminary estimate in a conference call that Nora listened to from her position as site warden, and she listened to the number he said with a steadiness that took more effort than she let anyone see. The 47 objects, assessed together, with the authentication evidence that had been developed over 3 weeks and the provenance research that was ongoing, carried a combined estimated value of somewhere between $280 and $350 million. The range reflected ongoing uncertainty about several pieces for which the authentication evidence was strong but not yet complete. As the research continued, the lower bound would likely rise. The room on the other end of the call was quiet for a moment after Galloway finished. Then someone from the State Historical Society asked a question that had been building underneath all the professional language for 3 weeks. Who does it belong to? Nora had thought about this question more than any other. She had thought about it on the spiral staircase and in the chamber and on the drive home and lying awake at 3 in the morning with the transcript of C.M.F.'s journal on the nightstand beside her. The legal answer was complicated. The objects had been on federal land inside a national wilderness area for most of their existence in the mountain, though of course neither the wilderness designation nor the federal ownership had existed when Finley had placed them there. The state had claims through the Historical Society. The Federal Park Service had claims through jurisdiction. And somewhere in the tangle of 140 years, there were the original families, the claimants who had signed those agreements in waxed linen, whose descendants, if any could be found, had a moral argument that no legal framework would entirely resolve. The legal answer was going to take years to work through. Nora understood that, and she was patient with it in a way that surprised some of the lawyers who dealt with her. But there was another answer to the question, the one that wasn't legal but that she kept returning to, because it was the one that felt true. It belonged to the people who were supposed to see it. Finley had written about this in the journal, in one of the clearer passages that needed little translation. He had written that the things he was protecting were not possessions in any ordinary sense. They were evidence. Evidence of what people had been capable of making, of reaching toward, of saying with their hands and their eyes and their accumulated knowledge of how light behaved and how a face held feeling. And evidence, he had written, was for everyone. You couldn't own evidence. You could only protect it until the time came when it could be seen. Nora had read that passage 3 times and then put the transcript down and stood at her kitchen window looking at the mountains and thought, the time came. Charles Monroe Finley. The time you were protecting it for finally came. And then, because she was who she was and it was nearly midnight and she had a patrol at 6 in the morning, she washed her mug and went to bed. But she didn't sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and thought about a man from the Scottish Highlands, watching his world end with the deliberate thoroughness that only organized power can bring to the destruction of ordinary life, who had decided that beauty was something that deserved to be stubborn, who had built a staircase inside a mountain and carried things down it, one by one, over years, making trip after trip into the cold and the altitude and the silence, until the shelves were full and the chamber was sealed and the mountain held what it held. She thought about the steps, worn smooth in the center from passing feet. She thought about the mortar repairs, patient and careful, generation after generation of Montana winters, someone coming back to check, to maintain, to make sure the seal held. She thought about the last journal entry, incomplete, ending mid-sentence, a man writing what he knew and running out of time before he could finish. She thought about the painting of the woman looking slightly to the left at something outside the frame, about the colors that had waited 140 years for someone to uncover them, about the gold leaf on the manuscript page still catching light the way it had when someone, in the 12th century, had decided that this thing was worth the time and care it took to make it beautiful. Outside her window, the mountains held their dark silence. The hollow was out there somewhere, the stone arch and the spiral staircase and the chamber where 47 things had been patiently surviving their way toward the moment when they could be seen again. She thought, I walked the right path in the right light and happened to look at the right angle. And she thought, I don't think that was an accident. I think I was supposed to find it. Not in any mystical sense. Not in the sense that fate had arranged things. But in the human sense, in the sense that Finley had chosen this mountain carefully, had thought about who traveled these ridges and what kind of attention they brought and what kind of patience they might have for the things that didn't announce themselves. He had built the structure with a specific quality of concealment, one that required a particular combination of circumstances to reveal itself. Not impossible circumstances, not lucky circumstances, Just the right circumstances for the right person on the right day. She wasn't sure she fully believed it, but she wasn't sure she didn't. She fell asleep eventually, as she always did, and dreamed of something she couldn't quite hold when she woke. Something that had to do with light and steps and the smell of stone, and the feeling of descending into a place where time had agreed, for a little while, to wait. The stone arch at the entrance was dusted with new snow that had fallen overnight, a light coating, barely an inch, that softened the edges of the worked stone and gave the structure a quality it hadn't had in daylight, something almost delicate, something that suggested vulnerability more than permanence, which was strange given what she knew about how long it had lasted. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she went down. The chamber was exactly as the team had left it. The Historical Society's padlock, the numbered tags on the shelves, the careful arrangement of the objects in their documented positions. In the beam of her flashlight, 47 wrapped things waited on their stone shelves the way they had waited for 140 years, and the patience of their waiting was something she felt in her chest rather than understood in her mind. She sat on the floor of the chamber, the leveled stone floor where Finley's tools had left their marks, and opened her thermos and poured coffee into the lid, and drank it slowly, and just looked. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She wasn't sure she was looking for anything. She was doing what she had learned to do with the landscape, being present enough that if something needed to be noticed, she would notice it. What she noticed was the table. She had seen it before, of course, had documented it, had noted the stone-top construction, the carved legs, the two objects on its surface. But she had been focused on those objects, the journal, the sealed metal box, and hadn't given the table itself much thought beyond its presence. Now she looked at it more carefully. The table was not a rough piece of work, not the utilitarian output of someone building for function alone. It had been made with care. The legs were proportioned correctly, slightly tapered at the base, with a carved detail at the top of each, not elaborate decoration, but a deliberate finishing touch, the mark of someone who had taken the time to make the thing beautiful when merely making it functional would have been enough. Finley had built a table and put a detail on the legs, inside a chamber that no one was ever supposed to see until the moment was right. He had known, presumably, that no one would see this detail for as long as the vault remained sealed. And he had done it anyway. That was what stayed with Nora when she thought about the man behind all of this, not the grand gesture of the vault itself, not the years of labor and the extraordinary logistical effort of getting 47 significant works of art across an ocean and a continent and up into a remote mountain hollow. Those things were impressive, but impressive in a way she could understand intellectually, as extraordinary effort in service of a clear goal. What she couldn't quite reach, intellectually, was the detail on the table legs. The small, unnecessary beauty, made in a place where no one would see it, for the sake of what, of principle, of habit, of the same understanding that had led him to build the vault in the first place. That beauty was its own reason, that making things with care was not something you did for an audience, but something you did because you understood what carelessness cost the world. She poured the last of her coffee and sat with that thought for a while. By the time she climbed back up the spiral staircase and out through the stone arch and walked back to her truck, the sun was fully over the eastern ridge and her shift was starting in 20 minutes, and she had 4 miles of trail to cover before the conservators arrived at 9. She drove with the heater on and the radio off and thought about Charles Monroe Finley, who had been dead for 140 years or thereabouts, and who had made a table with a carved detail on the legs inside a sealed chamber inside a mountain. She thought, I understand you. I don't know you at all, but I understand you. The people who came after that first month were different from the people who came in the first days. The early arrivals had been scientists and scholars, focused and deliberate and accustomed to moving carefully through uncertainty. The later arrivals were a different category. Administrators, legal representatives, journalists, officials from agencies whose jurisdiction over the situation was at best tangential and at worst non-existent, but who arrived with briefcases and business cards and the unshakable conviction that anything significant happening on any piece of land was at least partially their concern. Nora dealt with them with the same patient neutrality she had developed over years of dealing with difficult visitors, present, responsive, utterly immovable on the things that mattered. What mattered, as far as she was concerned, was the integrity of the site and the welfare of the objects in it. Those things were not negotiable. She had walked the right path in the right light and happened to look at the right angle. And she was now the site warden of something irreplaceable, and she intended to do that job with everything she had. She let the conservators work. She let Galloway pursue his authentication work. She let Suresh manage the archaeological process. She answered questions from the legal representatives clearly and without embellishment and directed them to Hartley when they tried to ask things above her pay grade. She gave one brief statement to a journalist from the local paper and declined all subsequent interview requests with a politeness that contained no hint of flexibility. She kept the padlock log, checking who had accessed the chamber and when and for how long. She filed her site warden reports every day with more thoroughness than was strictly required, because she understood that the written record she was creating now would matter in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. And in the evenings, after the team left and the hollow was quiet again, she read the translations. Suresh forwarded them as they came in, fresh sections of C.M.F.'s journal made legible by the linguist in Missoula who was working through them with the methodical care that the text deserved. Nora read them in order, following Finley across the years, watching him build what he built. The early entries were practical. He wrote about the selection of the site, the process of searching, over what was apparently several years, for a location that met his requirements. High enough to be remote and unmapped, geologically stable, with a natural mountain hollow that could be worked into an enclosed space without being structurally compromised. He had looked at more than a dozen sites before he found this one, and he described finding it with a restraint that made the feeling behind the words more visible, not less. He had written, "The mountain offered what was needed and I understood it to be the right place." The later entries grew more reflective. He wrote about the objects, sometimes, in terms that weren't authentication or documentation, but something more personal, what they had meant to the families who had entrusted them to him, what those families had understood about the things they were leaving behind. A painting of a grandmother, 3 generations back, which the family had kept not because it was valuable, but because looking at it had always made them feel that something of her had survived. A carved ivory figure that had come down through a family since before they had written records of it, in which they had described, in the agreement, as older than anyone could say. Maps. Letters. A set of watercolor studies of a coastline that no longer looked like those studies because the landscape had changed since they were made, which meant the paintings were the only evidence that the coastline had ever looked like that. Nora read a passage about the watercolors on a Thursday night and set the transcript down and looked at the wall across from her kitchen table for a long time. Evidence of how a coastline had looked before it changed. The paintings were not famous. They were not valuable in any market sense. They were 47 objects among 47 objects, wrapped in their oilcloth on their stone shelf, surviving. But they were evidence. An evidence of how something had looked before the world changed. It was exactly what Finley had said it was, irreplaceable. Something that couldn't be recreated because the moment it documented was gone. She picked up the transcript again. She kept reading. The authentication of the Van der Weyden took 6 weeks. Not because the evidence was ambiguous. Galloway had been right about that. The convergence of physical analysis and historical documentation was the kind that specialists spent careers hoping to encounter once, but because the process demanded a rigor proportional to the claim. You did not announce the rediscovery of a lost 15th-century Flemish master on the basis of one expert's opinion and a week of laboratory work. You built the case the way the mountain had been built, carefully and without shortcuts, each layer depending on the solidity of the one beneath it. Nora understood this and was patient with it. She had seen people rush toward conclusions before, in 11 years of rangering, and she had seen what happened when the ground beneath a conclusion turned out to be softer than it looked. The objects in the chamber had waited 140 years. They could wait another 6 weeks while the process was done correctly. Galloway brought in a second authentication specialist from Amsterdam, a woman named Dr. Lena Brandt, who had spent 20 years working with the Flemish primitives collection at the Rijksmuseum and who had the particular combination of deep technical knowledge and professional skepticism that the situation required. She arrived in Montana in November, when the snow had deepened and the roads to the hollow required 4-wheel drive, and she descended the spiral staircase with the same quality of stillness that Nora had seen in people who were about to encounter something they had spent their lives preparing for without knowing it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Brant spent 3 full days with the painting before she said anything substantive to anyone. She examined it under different light conditions, with and without magnification, with infrared reflectography equipment that a team from the University of Montana's Art Conservation Program had transported to the site. She studied the underdrawing, the preliminary sketch beneath the paint layer, visible only through infrared imaging, and compared it to underdrawings documented in the other 2 authenticated Van der Weyden portraits in institutional collections. She analyzed pigment samples taken from an area of minor existing damage with a portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. She read Galloway's documentation and then went back to the painting and read it again. On the 4th day, she found Nora at the chamber entrance, where Nora had taken to spending the first hour of her morning before the rest of the team arrived. "You're the one who found it," Brant said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes." Brant looked at the stone arch. "I've authenticated 3 works in my career that I would describe as genuinely important discoveries. Not important in the institutional sense, important in the sense that they changed something about what we understood." She paused. "This is different from those. This is different from anything I have encountered." Nora waited. "The painting is Van der Weyden," Brant said. "There is no version of the physical and historical evidence that supports any other conclusion. What we have here is the 3rd surviving portrait from his hand, and by some distance the best preserved of the 3. The other 2 have been treated, restored, cleaned, maintained by institutions for centuries. This one has not been touched since it was wrapped in oilcloth in the middle of the 19th century. What we are looking at is essentially the painting as it left the studio." The silence that followed was the kind that certain facts produced when they were large enough. "The woman," Nora said. "Who is she?" Brant almost smiled. "That is the other question. Van der Weyden's surviving portraits are generally of known subjects, nobility, clergy, wealthy merchants who commissioned their own likenesses. But this woman is not identified in any of the historical documentation we have found. The Finley estate records that have been located describe the painting as a portrait of unknown provenance, acquired by the first generation of the family in the early 16th century, which means it predates the family's own records. It was already old when they acquired it. So we don't know who she is. We know who painted her. We know approximately when. We know that someone thought her worth painting, and someone else thought the painting worth keeping. And that chain of people who thought it worth keeping extends from the Low Countries in 1455 to a mountain in Montana in the present day. Who she was, specifically, that may be something we never know." Nora thought about that. The woman looking slightly to the left at something outside the frame. A face held in paint for 570 years, surviving wars and ocean crossings, and a century and a half in a sealed mountain chamber, and still unnamed. Still looking at whatever she had been looking at. "Maybe that's all right," Nora said. Brant looked at her. "Yes," she said, after a moment. "I think it might be." The formal authentication announcement came 3 days later, released simultaneously by the University of Montana, the State Historical Society, and the Rijksmuseum, which had agreed to co-sponsor the authentication process in exchange for the right to host the painting for a period of public exhibition once the legal questions about ownership were resolved. The press release was careful, precise, and understated in the way that institutional communications about extraordinary things tended to be, as if the magnitude of the claim required the language around it to be correspondingly modest, lest the whole thing seem too large to be believed. The world did not receive it modestly. Nora was at her desk filing site warden reports when Hartley appeared in her doorway for the 2nd time in a month with the expression she had learned to read. This time it was different, the same expression, but layered over something that looked, on careful examination, like a man trying very hard not to laugh. "The phone," he said, "has not stopped." She looked up. "News organizations. 16 so far this morning. 2 from London, 1 from Amsterdam, 1 from Tokyo. The state governor's office called. A senator's office called. Someone from the Smithsonian called." He paused. "Someone claiming to represent a private collector called to offer what they described as a substantial sum for exclusive viewing access." Nora put down her pen. "They were told no. They were told no with considerable warmth and clarity. Yes." She picked up her pen again. "Good. There's also a historian from Edinburgh University. A Dr. Catriona MacPhail. She's been researching the Highland clearances for 20 years, and she says she has documentation relating to Charles Monroe Finley that she has not been able to publish because until now there was no physical evidence to corroborate it. Nora set the pen down again. What kind of documentation? Hartley held out a printed email. She took it and read it. Then she read it again. Dr. MacPhail had been collecting oral histories and fragmentary records from the descendants of families displaced during the clearances for 2 decades. In the course of that work, she had encountered, in the archive of a small church in the Scottish Highlands, a cache of letters written by Charles Monroe Finley to a factor, a land agent in the 1850s. The letters described, obliquely but unmistakably, the process of receiving objects from families who were being cleared from their land, and the intention to carry those objects to a place of safety in the Americas. They also described, in a passage that MacPhail had never been able to make, full sense of what sounded like a construction project of considerable scale in a location that no one had been able to identify. Until now. Nora read the email twice, then handed it back to Hartley. "Get her on the phone," she said. Dr. MacPhail was in her office in Edinburgh when Nora called, which given the time difference meant it was late evening there, and she answered with the focused alertness of someone who had been waiting for this call and had not been sleeping particularly well in the days since she had sent the email. She was measured in her language, careful in her claims, precise in the way of someone who had spent 20 years building arguments on fragmentary evidence and had learned the cost of overstating what she knew. But beneath the measured language there was something Nora recognized because she felt it herself, a quality of sustained, contained excitement, the kind that came from years of working toward a question that had finally, unexpectedly, opened into an answer. "The letters are in the church archive," MacPhail said. 34 of them, written over 8 years. I've been attempting to publish analysis of them for 6 years, and every time I have, peer reviewers have noted the absence of corroborating physical evidence. There was no record of Finley reaching the Americas. No immigration documents, no land purchase records, no death certificate. He simply disappeared from the historical record around 1848, as far as the official documentation was concerned. People disappeared from the record in those years, Nora said. Constantly. The clearances were administered with a thoroughness that extended to the erasure of the people being cleared. But the letters existed, and they described something specific enough that I could never quite dismiss it. And then a week ago I saw the news from Montana. What do the letters say about the construction? MacPhail read from her notes, translating as she went, the archaic phrasing rendered into something that moved between the formal and the vivid. Finley had written about finding a place that the mountain itself seemed to have prepared, as if the land had understood what was needed before the need was made clear. He had written about the labor of cutting stone and descending into the earth, about the months it took to level the floor and fit the shelves. He had written, in a passage that MacPhail said had occupied her for years without resolution, about a staircase that turned as it descended, so that a man coming down it could not see where he was going until he was already there. A staircase that turned as it descended, Nora said. Yes, which I read as a practical description of a spiral stair, and also, I suspect, as a kind of statement about the nature of the project itself. He was a man who thought in those terms. The letters are full of that quality, a practical intelligence that was also, always, reaching for something beyond the practical. Nora thought about the detail on the table legs. I know what you mean, she said. MacPhail flew to Montana 2 weeks later. She arrived at the site on a morning when the snow had eased and the sun was out, and the hollow held a particular quality of winter light that made the stone arch cast a shadow, so precise it looked drawn rather than natural. She stood in front of the arch for a long moment, and Nora, watching from a few paces back, saw on the historian's face the expression of a person completing something that had taken 2 decades. They descended the staircase together. In the chamber, MacPhail moved along the shelves with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes moving from object to object in the careful, comprehensive way of someone making an inventory that was also a reckoning. She stopped in front of the stone table. She looked at the object that had been there when Nora arrived, the sealed metal box, which the conservators had by now opened carefully and found to contain a set of small keys, iron, matching a pattern that corresponded to no lock anyone had yet identified, and then she looked at the shelf above the table, where several of the wrapped objects had been moved during the documentation process. He built it to last, MacPhail said. Not to Nora particularly. To the chamber, or to Finley, or to no one. He maintained it, Nora said. The mortar repairs. The exterior. He came back. The letters stop in 1856. The last one describes what sounds like a final journey. He writes about closing something up properly, about making sure it would hold against whatever the coming years brought. MacPhail turned slowly, taking in the full chamber. He was in his 60s by then, if the chronology is right. He made this journey in his 60s, in Montana, in winter, to check that the seal held. What happened to him after that? I don't know. The letters stop. He may have died on the return journey. He may have lived for years more and simply stopped writing to the factor. The record doesn't say. Nora thought about the last journal entry, incomplete, ending mid-sentence. He ran out of time, she said. But not before the work was done. The legal process that had been working its way through multiple jurisdictions since the discovery's first days had begun, by the time MacPhail arrived, to produce its first tentative conclusions. This was not because the law moved quickly, it didn't, and everyone involved had adjusted their expectations accordingly, but because the nature of the claim was unusual enough that it had attracted the attention of people who moved faster than the usual institutional pace. The objects in the chamber were not stolen. That was the first and most important legal determination, and it came from a federal agency in consultation with the State Historical Society and an international legal team that had been assembled specifically for this case. Finley had not taken the objects without consent. He had received them from families who were giving them willingly, documented in the agreements that were among the papers in the chamber, signed and witnessed in the formal manner of the period. He had been a trustee, not a thief, which meant the question of ownership was fundamentally about succession, about who, if anyone, could be identified as the legitimate heir to the original owner's claims, across 140 years of family dispersal and death and the fragmentary records of displaced communities. MacPhail, whose 2 decades of oral history work had given her something no legal team could have assembled quickly, was central to this process. She had names. She had family trees, incomplete but real, traced through church records and census documents and the kinds of informal genealogical knowledge that communities hold collectively when they have been kept together by circumstance and memory. She had, in some cases, living people. The calls she made in the weeks following her visit to the chamber were the ones she had been preparing for without knowing it for 20 years. She called a man in Inverness who was the great-great-great-grandchild of a family who had been cleared from their land in 1849 and who had, according to his grandmother's stories, left something precious in the care of a man they trusted. She called a woman in Nova Scotia whose family had emigrated in the same years and who had a photograph, faded and small, of a painting that had hung in the family home before the clearance, a painting that matched, in its dimensions and its subject matter, one of the objects currently on a shelf in the Montana chamber. She called, in total, 19 people across 6 countries. Not all of them had provable claims. Not all of them could demonstrate the chain of custody that a court would require. But enough of them could, and the process of establishing those claims, though slow, began to move with the kind of inevitability that happens when enough evidence has accumulated to leave the law no credible alternative but to follow it. Nora watched this process from her position as site warden and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction, but was related to both. She had found the chamber. She had documented it correctly, protected it, maintained its integrity through the weeks of assessment and the months of legal process. But what was happening now, the connection of the objects in the mountain to the families from which they had come, that was larger than anything she had done, larger than the discovery itself. That was the purpose of the vault, finally being served after a century and a half of patient waiting. The first repatriation happened in February, for months after Nora had come down the ridge and seen the straight line that didn't belong. It was a modest piece, relatively speaking one of the watercolor studies of the Scottish coastline, painted by an artist whose name was not recorded, depicting a bay on the northwest coast that no longer looked precisely as it was shown because the headland on the left side of the image had eroded significantly in the intervening century and a half. The family that received it was represented by a woman in her 70s named Agnes Sutherland, who had taken a flight from Glasgow to Chicago to Montana because she had not been willing to let a proxy receive it on her behalf. She was a small woman with white hair and a straightforwardness of manner that reminded Nora of people she had known in the rangering district, people who had spent their lives in physical landscapes and had developed an honest relationship with the scale of things. She descended the spiral staircase without hesitation and stood in front of the shelf where the watercolor had been documented, and when Suresh brought the wrapped piece out and set it on the stone table and began to open the oilcloth, Agnes Sutherland watched with an expression of such complete attention that everything else in the chamber seemed to recede. The oilcloth came away. The watercolor was there. Its colors not quite what they would have been at the moment of painting. Some fading had occurred despite the preservation. The blues a little quieter, the greens a little more muted but clear and present and recognizable. The particular bay, the particular quality of northern light, the small boat in the middle distance that the painter had included and that, according to the family's oral history, had belonged to Agnes Sutherland's ancestor and had been the last thing he had looked at when he left. Agnes Sutherland stood very still for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "That's the bay." Her voice was steady. "My grandmother described it. Her grandmother described it to her. We knew what it looked like from the descriptions, but we had never seen it." She looked up from the painting to Nora, who was standing at the edge of the chamber as the site warden, present but not intrusive, the way she had learned to be in places where other people's significant moments were happening. "You found this," Agnes Sutherland said. "I walked the right path," Nora said. The older woman shook her head slowly. "You walked the path someone built. That's different." She looked around the chamber, at the shelves, at the stone table, at the spiral staircase ascending out of sight above them. "He built this for us. All of us who had lost something. He built it so we would get it back." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes were very bright. "I want you to know that I understand what he did, what it cost him, and I want you to know that this being here, seeing this is something I will carry for the rest of my life." Nora didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't diminish what had just been said. She stood in the chamber of Charles Monroe Finley's making and let the moment be what it was. The process of formal legal repatriation was lengthy and bureaucratically complex in the way that all processes involving multiple national jurisdictions and historical claims tended to be, but it moved steadily. And by spring it was clear that the framework being established would ultimately result in every provably identified object being returned to the family or institution that could demonstrate rightful connection to it. The objects without provable claims, a smaller number than anyone had initially expected, given MacPhail's research, would pass through the State Historical Society into public museum collections, accessible to everyone. The Van der Weyden was in this latter category. No family claim could be established for the portrait. The painting predated the Finley family's own records, and the chain of ownership before their acquisition had not been reconstructed from any surviving documentation. It belonged, in the legal sense, to the public, to the institution that would house it, and the people who would come to see it. The Rijksmuseum's interest in housing it for the initial exhibition period was formalized into a longer arrangement, pending the construction of permanent display conditions in an institution closer to where it had been found. There were discussions about a dedicated gallery. There were discussions, even, about a small museum at the site itself, designed in consultation with the landscape and the winter conditions, built to be seen rather than to be merely functional. None of this had been resolved by spring. But the direction was clear, and the direction was toward the painting being seen, which was, as far as Nora was concerned, exactly what Finley had built the vault to make possible. She had been thinking about Finley differently as the months passed. In the first weeks after the discovery, she had thought of him primarily in terms of what he had built and what he had preserved, the practical achievement of the vault, the 47 objects on the shelves. But as MacPhail's research deepened and the picture of the man became more detailed, she found herself thinking about the human cost of what he had done. The man who had watched his world come apart, who had stood in a clearing that had been someone's home and received, from the hands of someone who had nowhere else to put what mattered, an object that represented something irreplaceable, who had then carried that weight literally and figuratively across an ocean and a continent, and up into the mountains and down a staircase he had cut from living rock. What had it cost him, she wondered, to be the person who could be trusted with other people's most precious things? Not just the physical labor, not just the years of it, but the weight of being the one who understood what was being lost and was doing something about it. There was a particular kind of loneliness in that, she thought. The loneliness of being the person who sees clearly what most people would rather not see, and who acts on what they see. She had felt something like it herself in the weeks of the discovery. The knowledge of what was in the chamber, combined with the slow bureaucratic pace of the formal process, combined with the awareness that the world outside was already pressing toward the site with the usual mixture of genuine interest and opportunistic attention, all of it had produced in her a quality of guardianship that was also, honestly, isolating. She was responsible for something that mattered in a way that exceeded the ordinary scale of her work. And responsibility at that scale was a form of solitude, even when you were surrounded by people. She told this to MacPhail one evening in early spring, when the historian had returned to Montana for a second research visit, and they had ended up at Nora's kitchen table with the transcript of Finley's journal between them. She hadn't intended to say it. It arrived in the conversation without planning, the way things did when you had been thinking about them for long enough. MacPhail listened without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at the transcript. He describes something like that in the later entries, she said. Not directly. He doesn't write about loneliness as an emotional state. He wasn't that kind of writer. But there's a passage, late in the journal, where he writes about the mountain and what it means to him to come back to it. He says the mountain knows what's in it. He says the mountain keeps the secret because the mountain understands the necessity. She paused, which is a strange thing to say about a geological formation. But I think what he's really saying is that the work itself is the companion, that doing the thing that needs to be done is its own form of company. Nora sat with that. The mountain knows what's in it, she said. Yes. She looked out the window at the dark outline of the ridgeline against the night sky. The hollow was out there, the stone arch and the spiral staircase and the chamber where fewer objects rested on the shelves now, some already gone to the families they had been waiting for, the rest waiting their turn. The Van der Weyden was still there, crated now in climate-controlled packaging, waiting for the transport arrangements that were being finalized. I've been out to the chamber almost every day since the discovery, Nora said. Even when there's nothing that requires the site warden's presence. I just go down. I know, MacPhail said. I noticed. I think I'm trying to understand something about him, about why he did it the way he did it. She paused. Not why he built the vault. That part one understand. But why he made it beautiful. The table, the detail on the legs. The staircase, he could have cut a straight stair, a ladder almost, and it would have been functional. But he cut a spiral. He made the descent into something that turned on itself, something you couldn't see the end of until you were already there. MacPhail was quiet for a moment. In the letters, she said slowly, there's a phrase he uses twice. In different contexts, but the same words. He writes, and I'll translate loosely, that the manner of a thing is its meaning. That how something is made is what it says about why. She looked at Nora. I think the spiral staircase is a statement. I think the detail on the table legs is a statement. He was saying that what he was doing deserved to be done beautifully, because what he was protecting was beautiful, and the two things could not be separated. Nora sat with that for a long time. Outside, the mountains held their silence. The spring thaw was beginning somewhere above the valley. She could tell from the sound of water that hadn't been there a week ago, the particular melt drip of snowpack beginning its annual migration downward. I think that's right, she said finally. MacPhail closed the transcript carefully. You know what I think is remarkable about this? Not the paintings, not the money, not even the authentication of the Van der Weyden. What I think is remarkable is that he succeeded. He set out to protect something, and protect it he did, across 140 years and everything that happened in those years, and it survived intact, and it is now being returned to the world it was taken from. How often does that happen? How often does someone's best intention survive long enough to fulfill itself? The question settled into the kitchen and stayed there. Nora didn't answer it, because it didn't require an answer. It required sitting with. The formal public announcement of the full scope of the discovery, all 47 objects, their identities, their estimated values, their provenance and legal status came in March, 6 months after Nora had descended the spiral staircase for the first time. The announcement was made jointly by the State Historical Society, the Park Service, the University of Montana, and the international coalition of institutions and legal bodies that had been assembled to manage the process. It was delivered at a press conference in the state capitol that Nora attended but did not speak at, because she had declined every opportunity to speak publicly and intended to go on declining them. The number that the press received and repeated for weeks afterward was the combined estimated value of the 47 objects, $312 million, with the Van der Weyden alone accounting for more than 40% of that figure. The number was accurate. It was also, Nora felt, beside the point in a way that was difficult to explain to people who had not been in the chamber. The chamber was not a vault of money. It was a vault of evidence of what people had made when they were reaching towards something, of what other people had valued enough to entrust to a mountain, of what the mountain had kept for them. The money was a measure of what the world outside the mountain was willing to acknowledge about the significance of those things. It was not the same as the things themselves, but she understood why the number mattered to people. She understood that $312 million was a way of saying something that was otherwise hard to say, that what had been in the mountain was real, was important, was worth the attention it was receiving. Numbers performed a kind of translation. They made the immeasurable measurable, or at least gave it a form that the world could hold. She held the number in her mind the way she held all the facts of the discovery present, accounted for, neither more nor less than what they were. What she held more privately, more persistently, was the image of Agnes Sutherland standing in front of the watercolor of the Scottish Bay. The steadiness of her voice saying, "That's the bay." The precision of her phrasing, we knew what it looked like from the descriptions. We had never seen it. For months after the discovery, Nora was granted a week of leave that she had accumulated and never used, and she spent it doing something she had not done in 11 years of living on the edge of the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness. She traveled. Not far. Only to Glasgow, and then north by train, and then by a rented car along roads that narrowed as she drove, into the part of Scotland where the landscape had the same quality as the Montana mountains, not similar in geography, but similar in temperament, a landscape that made demands on the attention of anyone who entered it and rewarded those demands with a particular clarity. She had not told MacPhail she was coming. She had not told anyone, in fact, except Hartley, because Hartley needed to know where his site warden was. She drove to the place where the letters in the church archive had been written, a village on the northwest coast that was small and windswept and matter-of-fact about its own persistence in a way she recognized. She walked the bay that MacPhail had identified as the one shown in the watercolor studies. She stood on the headland that had eroded since the paintings were made and looked at the water. The light on the water was not the same as the light in the paintings. The headland was shorter. The small boat was gone, obviously, along with the man who had owned it and the world that had contained them both. But the bay was there, still shaped by the same mountains behind it, still opening to the same sea, still holding the particular quality of northern Atlantic light that the painter had tried to capture, and that, in the watercolor, they had captured well enough that Agnes Sutherland had recognized it from a description she had received as a child. Nora stood on the headland for an hour. The wind was cold and direct and unambiguous, the kind of wind that didn't negotiate. She stood in it and looked at the water and thought about Finlay standing somewhere near here, 170 years ago, receiving things from people who had no other choice and understanding that what he was receiving was not just objects but trust. She thought about the staircase that turned as it descended. The manner of a thing is its meaning. She thought, you knew that what you were doing was right. Not convenient, not comfortable, not safe. Right. And you did it the way you did everything, carefully, beautifully, with full attention to the work and no particular interest in whether anyone would know your name. She drove back to Glasgow that evening and flew home the next morning. She was back at the Hollow by the afternoon of the following day, checking the padlock, logging the entry, walking the perimeter of the site the way she had walked it every day for 6 months. The staircase was there. The chamber was there. The stone table with the carved detail on the legs was there. 3 of the shelves were empty now, the objects that had rested on them gone to the families they had been waiting for. The remaining pieces waited with the same patience they had always had, which was the patience of things that understood they were in good hands. Nora went to the empty shelves and stood in front of them. In the beam of her flashlight, the stone showed the ghost of where the objects had rested, a slight darkening at the contact points, the faintest imprint of decades of careful placement. She reached out and touched one of the dark spots with the tip of one gloved finger. The stone was cold. The cold of mountain rock, which was not the cold of weather but the cold of time, the temperature of something that had been accumulating its own history for longer than anything she had ever touched. She stood there for a while, in the chamber of the hollow mountain, with the empty shelves and the full ones, and the stone table, and the staircase ascending in its patient spiral above her. Outside, the Montana spring was beginning its slow conversion of the landscape, snow retreating toward the high places, the meadow and the hollow beginning to consider the possibility of wildflowers. She thought about what MacPhail had said. How often does someone's best intention survive long enough to fulfill itself? Not often enough, she thought. But sometimes. Sometimes a man built a staircase inside a mountain and carried things down it one by one, and sealed the chamber, and came back for decades to make sure the seal held. And then the world changed, and the mountain kept its word. And one morning a ranger walked the right path in the right light, and looked at the right angle, and saw a straight line that didn't belong, and went toward it. She turned off her flashlight and climbed the spiral staircase in the dark, one hand trailing the smooth stone wall, counting the steps by feel. She had counted them so many times she knew the number without thinking. At the top she came through the stone arch into the spring air, and the afternoon light of the hollow hit her face. And above her the ridgeline was sharp and clear against a sky that had decided, at last, to be blue. She locked the padlock. She logged the visit. She walked back up the slope to the service road, checking the snow conditions out of habit, noting the early signs of seasonal change in the way the melt was tracking. She had a lot of work still ahead of her. The legal process was ongoing. The remaining objects needed continued care. The documentation was never truly finished. There was always more to record, more to verify, more to protect against the ordinary attrition of time and attention. The Van der Weyden needed to be transported safely, eventually, to wherever it would live. The empty shelves needed to be documented in their emptiness, because emptiness after purpose was its own kind of record. But tonight she would drive home and make dinner and read the latest section of MacPhail's translation of the journal. The historian had sent a new batch of pages that morning, sections from the 1870s that had been among the most difficult to decipher and were only now becoming legible, and she would sit at her kitchen table with the Montana mountains outside her window, and she would follow an old man's words through the years of his long, patient work. She would read about what he had understood and what he had done about it. She would carry it the way she was learning to carry all of it, not as a burden, because it wasn't that, but as the kind of weight that told you something about what you were capable of holding. The kind that, when you stopped and thought about it honestly, felt less like something added to your life, and more like something that had always been part of it, waiting for you to be ready. The hollow settled around her as she climbed. The stone arch disappeared behind the slope. The sky above the ridgeline was moving toward the colors of late afternoon, the gold coming into the light, the shadows lengthening down the east faces. She walked steadily, as she always did, not rushing, paying attention. What she hadn't anticipated, in those early months, was the degree to which the discovery would change the texture of her ordinary work. She was the same ranger she had always been. She walked the same routes, documented the same conditions, maintained the same trails and markers and emergency caches. But the mountain had told her something she hadn't known before, and knowing it changed the quality of her attention in a way she couldn't entirely explain. She had always been a person who looked carefully. That was the foundation of the work: observation, documentation, the patient accumulation of what was actually there rather than what you expected to find. But the hollow had added something. A dimension she hadn't known was missing. She looked now not just at what was present, but at what might be present beneath the surface, behind the obvious, in the places where a particular angle of light or a particular quality of attention could reveal something that ordinary-looking missed. She found things. Not other vaults. She was under no illusion that Charles Monroe Finley had left more than one, but smaller things, the kind that the landscape kept as a matter of course, and that only the right quality of observation could surface. A foundation line barely visible beneath decades of pine duff, running along a section of trail she had walked 100 times, that turned out when she reported it to be the remnant of a trading post marked on a territorial map from 1862. A series of marks on a cliff face, methodical and regular, that a historian of indigenous land use identified as a seasonal record kept by people who had been tracking the same landscape Nora walked centuries before her. A stone structure in a different hollow, much simpler than Finley's chamber, that turned out to be a winter cache used by early trappers, its contents long since gone, but its construction still sound enough to suggest the people who built it had understood the mountain the same way Finley had, as a collaborator rather than an obstacle. She reported all of these findings through the proper channels, documented them with the same thoroughness she had brought to the hollow, and handed them to the historians and archaeologists who could make better sense of them than she could. She did not think of herself as a discoverer. She thought of herself as the person who walked the paths and looked carefully and understood that the landscape was always saying something if you were willing to slow down enough to listen. What the hollow had given her was a better understanding of what listening required. Galloway called her in late March, from Chicago, to tell her that the Van der Weyden had been formally accepted into the temporary custody of the Rijksmuseum, pending the longer-term institutional arrangement. The painting would be transported in a climate-controlled crate by a specialist art handling company, accompanied by a conservator from the University of Montana who had been working with the piece since the authentication. It would travel by ground to a controlled facility in Seattle, then by air freight with continuous monitoring, then by ground again to Amsterdam. "I wanted you to know before the announcement," he said. "I appreciate that. There will be a public viewing. The museum is planning a dedicated exhibition, not just the Van der Weyden, but the full story. The discovery, the authentication, Finley, the families. They want to tell the whole thing." "Good," Nora said. She meant it without reservation. "They've asked if you'd be willing to participate. An interview, a statement, something that conveys the experience of the discovery from the perspective of the person who made it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's more than I expected," Galloway said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. She did think about it. For 2 weeks, she turned the question over in the evenings when she wasn't reading the journal translations, considering what she would say if she said anything, whether her saying it would add something genuine or only perform a kind of human interest that the story didn't need. The story had its own human interest. It had Finley and the families and Agnes Sutherland in the chambers saying that's the bay. It didn't require her. But she also thought about what MacPhail had said, "You walk the path someone built." And she thought about what Finley had written, "The manner of a thing is its meaning." And she thought that perhaps there was something worth saying about the manner of finding about what it meant to walk carefully through a landscape and to notice the things that didn't belong, not because they were hidden from her, but because she had slowed down enough for them to become visible. She called Galloway back at the end of the second week. She said she would write something. Not an interview. She didn't want to be filmed, didn't want to be the face of the story in any way that would make her more prominent than the objects and the people connected to them, but a statement, something that said what she actually thought, in the language she actually used, without performance. She wrote it over 3 evenings at her kitchen table, drafting and revising with the same methodical attention she brought to site warden reports, except that the standard for accuracy here was different, not factual accuracy, but emotional accuracy, the precision of saying what was true about an experience rather than what was merely true about an event. The statement she sent to Galloway was 400 words. She didn't read it again after she sent it. She trusted that it said what she had meant it to say, and she let it go. The spring deepened into early summer, and the hollow changed character entirely, the snow retreating to the upper edges of the surrounding ridges, the meadow below the stone arch filling with exactly the kind of wildflowers she had expected: columbine and blue flax, and the small white clusters of something she could never remember the name of that appeared every year in the shadier corners of the hollow and persisted long after the more assertive flowers had faded. She walked the hollow regularly now, not just for site warden duties, but because she had come to understand it as part of her territory in a new way. It was hers the way none of the land was exactly hers, not by ownership, but by the particular attention she had brought to it and what that attention had made visible. She sat one afternoon in early June on the section of the south wall she had cleared on the day of the discovery, in a spot where the afternoon sun reached, and ate her lunch and looked at the meadow filling with color below the arch. The padlock was on its staple behind her. The chamber was as it had been that morning when she checked it. One more object removed last week by the family from Nova Scotia who had driven across the country in a rented car because they too had not been willing to let a proxy do it for them. One more set of oilcloth wrappings folded and archived by the conservators. One more shelf showing the ghost mark of long-term contact. She thought about the woman in the painting. The Van der Weyden. On its way to Amsterdam now. in its climate-controlled crate, traveling across the ocean that Finley had crossed in the opposite direction 170 years ago with the painting wrapped and protected among his cargo. A reversal of the journey. A return of a kind, not to the Low Countries where it had been made, but to a museum in the country that shared its heritage, where it would be seen by people who brought to the act of looking whatever they brought their own histories, their own losses, their own sense of what beauty demanded of the people who encountered it. She hoped they would stand in front of it long enough. She hoped they would look at what the woman in the painting was looking at, that thing outside the frame, and allow themselves to not quite know what it was. She hoped they would feel the 500 years between themselves and the painter as something real rather than something merely historical, as actual time, actual accumulated human effort. All the people who had lived between then and now who had also looked at something and reached toward it and tried to say what they saw with whatever they had in their hands. She finished her lunch and folded the wrapper carefully into her pack. She stood and brushed the snow grit off the back of her trousers' old habit. The snow was long gone from this elevation, but the motion was as automatic as breathing. She turned and looked at the stone arch. In summer light, it was different from winter light. Less stark, more detailed, the worked stone showing its construction more clearly without the snow smoothing its surfaces. She could see exactly where Finley's hands had set the keystone of the arch, the slight forward lean of it, the way the courses on either side splayed outward from that center point to distribute the load. A structural decision made 170 years ago by a man with hard-won knowledge and strong hands, and a clear idea of what he was building and why. She unlocked the padlock and went down one more time. The chamber was cool and still and smelled of mountain stone and the faint clean scent of the oilcloth material that the conservators had left folded on the table. The shelves held what they held. The stone table held the folded cloth and the metal box with its small iron keys, which no one had yet matched to any lock, and which Nora privately suspected would remain unmatched, another of Finley's quiet mysteries. Something kept close even in his documentation, the particular key to something he had not described. She stood in the center of the chamber and let the stillness be what it was. She had been coming here long enough that the stillness no longer felt like absence. It felt like the chamber's character, its way of being in the world, the manner of the thing, which was also its meaning. She thought, 140 years, Charles. And every object is accounted for. Not one thing lost. Not one seal broken that you didn't intend to be broken. The manner was the meaning, and the meaning held. She let herself feel the full weight of that for a moment. The grief in it for a man who had given everything to a work that he had known he would not live to see completed, and the other thing alongside the grief, the thing that didn't have a single clean name, that was part gratitude, and part wonder, and part the specific comfort that came from understanding that sometimes the long arc of a good intention bent far enough to arrive. Then she turned off her flashlight and climbed the spiral staircase for the 10,000th time, or something close to it, and came up through the arch into the June afternoon, and locked the padlock, and walked back up the slope. The meadow was very green in the long evening light. The columbine had opened fully, the blue-purple of it exact and unhurried, the kind of color that didn't negotiate with the conditions around it, but simply was. She walked through it without picking anything, as she always did, and climbed the ridge, and drove home through the long Montana dusk with the windows cracked and the cool air coming in and the ridgeline, keeping pace alongside her all the way to town. She had a message from MacPhail waiting when she got home. The historian had found something new in the church archive, a single letter, previously misfiled with records from a different decade, that appeared to be the last communication Finley had sent before the journal entries stopped. It was brief, MacPhail wrote. It was written in a hand that was clearly aged and clearly tired, but it was legible, and what it said was this: "The work is finished. What was entrusted to me is safe. I am content." Nora read the message twice. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and looked out the window at the darkening ridge for a long time. She thought about a man writing those words, putting down his pen, closing a door that would not be opened for 140 years. She thought about the weight of being content when contentment had cost that much, when the work of a lifetime had been done in a place where no one knew it, for people who were already gone, against a future that was entirely uncertain. She thought, he was right to be content. He earned it completely. She made tea and sat with the mountains in the window and read the rest of MacPhail's message, which went on with the careful, precise excitement of a historian who had just found the last piece of something she had been assembling for 20 years. The lamp was warm on the table. Outside, the last light left the ridgeline, and the stars came out over the Beartooth, sharp and present and unambiguous, the way they always were at altitude when the air was clear, the way they had been on the night Finley had sealed his chamber and turned toward whatever was left of his life, carrying the knowledge of what he had done and the certainty that it was enough. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The exhibition opened in Amsterdam on a Tuesday in October, exactly 1 year and 4 days after Nora had come around the shoulder of the ridge and seen the straight line that didn't belong. She knew the date precisely because she had written it in her log on the day of the discovery, and she had been keeping track without meaning to, the way you kept track of things that had changed the shape of your life without asking permission. She had not planned to attend the opening. She had declined the invitation twice, politely, and then declined the follow-up with the same politeness, and had gone on with her work through the summer and into the fall, the site warden duties winding down now as the legal process matured and the chamber transitioned from an active archaeological site into a formally designated historical landmark under joint federal and state stewardship. The padlock was still on the arch. She still held a key. She still walked down the spiral staircase once a week, not because protocol required it, but because she had decided that it required it, that the place deserved regular human attention, and she was the right person to provide it. She was at her desk in mid-September when Galloway called from Chicago for the third time about the exhibition, and this time something in his voice was different, not urgency exactly, but a quality of genuine feeling underneath the professional manner that she hadn't heard from him before, and she found herself listening in a different way. "There's something I should tell you," he said, "that I haven't told you yet, because I wanted to be certain before I said it." She waited. "The statement you wrote. The 400 words you sent me in the spring. The Rijksmuseum used it. They printed it on the wall of the exhibition, at the entrance, before anything else. Before the Van der Weyden, before the historical context, before any of the other objects. Your words are the first thing people will read when they walk in." She was quiet for a moment. "They asked my permission," Galloway continued. "I told them the right person to ask was you. They said they tried, and you didn't respond. I didn't respond to a lot of things this summer. Nora, your words are on the wall of a major international museum, in front of a Van der Weyden. I thought you might want to see that." She looked out the window at the ridge. The aspens had turned, the gold of them against the dark evergreen more vivid than it had any right to be. She had been looking at that view for 11 years, and it still stopped her every October. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 3 days, and then she called Hartley and asked for a week of leave and booked a flight to Amsterdam. She did not tell anyone else she was going. She did not notify the museum. She bought a ticket to the exhibition online like anyone else, and she went. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Amsterdam in October was gray and cold and canal-threaded, the light coming off the water at angles that reminded her, obscurely, of the quality of light in the hollow on winter mornings. She walked from her hotel to the museum on the morning after she arrived, through streets that were navigating the particular democratic chaos of a European city in a way that made her feel very much from elsewhere, but not unwelcomely so. She was not a person who was made uncomfortable by unfamiliar places. She was a person who paid attention in them, and paying attention was a reasonable way to be anywhere. The museum was large and well-attended, even on a Tuesday morning in October, the queues orderly and multilingual. She joined one and moved through it at the pace of the crowd, and when she reached the entrance of the exhibition wing, she stopped in front of the wall that Galloway had described and read what was written there. She read her own words on the wall of the Rijksmuseum and felt something she hadn't anticipated, not pride exactly, not embarrassment, but a kind of vertigo, the feeling of having sent something out into the world and then discovered that the world had taken it seriously. The words said what she had meant them to say. She was satisfied with that. But seeing them in this context, large, set in careful typography, preceding the Van der Weyden and everything that came with it, made them feel different than they had felt at her kitchen table. She moved on into the exhibition. The curators had done something she hadn't expected. She had imagined a conventional museum presentation objects on walls, labels, scholarly context. What they had built instead was a story. The exhibition moved chronologically, beginning not with the objects but with the world they had come from. The Scotland of the 1840s and 1850s, the clearances, the systematic displacement of communities from land they had worked for generations. Maps showing the extent of it. Photographs from slightly later, the landscape emptied of the people who had shaped it. The names of families, the records of what they lost. Then Finley, the letters from MacPhail's archive, translated and displayed. The journal entries, selected passages rendered in both the original and the translation, set beside photographs of the Montana landscape. The stone arch, the spiral staircase photographed from above, its helix visible all the way to the chamber floor. The empty shelves, documented in their emptiness after the repatriations, each bare section labeled with the name of the object that had rested there and the family that had received it. And then the objects themselves. Not all 47 many were now with the families who had claimed them, or in other institutions, or still moving through the legal process. But a significant number had been loaned for the exhibition by the families and institutions that held them, and they were here, and they were displayed not as isolated masterworks, but as what they actually were. Things that people had loved and entrusted and protected, things that carried the evidence of specific human lives and specific human understanding. The context made them different. The provenance, the history, the cost, knowing all of it changed what it felt like to stand in front of them. She stood in front of the Van der Weyden for a long time. The painting was larger than she remembered, which was strange because she had measured it herself during the documentation. But in the chamber, lit only by flashlights in a small cold space, it had had a different scale than it had here, hanging in a dedicated room designed around it, lit with the precision of people who had spent considerable thought on the question of how to show this particular painting in a way that honored what it was. The light was warm, but not yellow. It caught the surface at the angle that revealed the brushwork without creating glare, and the brushwork was extraordinary, she could see now. In these conditions, details she had been too focused on documentation to properly attend to in the chamber. The way the light on the woman's hands had been built up in layers, each layer adding a translucency that gave the skin its quality of being lit from within rather than from without. The way the background was not flat but had a depth to it, an atmosphere, a sense of air existing in the space behind the figure. And the woman herself, the particular quality of her inwardness, the face that was looking at something outside the frame with an attention so complete that it made you wonder what she was seeing, and whether whatever she saw was something you might also see if you stood in the right place, or whether it was something private, something that had belonged to her alone, and that the painter had seen in her face and had known he couldn't name, but had rendered anyway, with all the skill he had, because the fact of it was worth recording even if the content of it could not be said. Nora stood in front of the painting for 20 minutes. People moved around her, pausing and moving on at the pace that museum visitors moved. She stood still in the way she stood still in the landscape, when she was waiting for something to become visible, and she looked at the woman in the painting looking at her unknowable thing, and she thought about all the people who had looked at this painting before her. The people in Finley's family who had owned it for 3 generations before the clearances. Finley himself, wrapping it in oilcloth with the care of someone who understood what he was protecting. The sealed darkness of the chamber, where the painting had waited without an audience for 140 years. And now this room, these people, this light. The chain of it. The absolute stubbornness of the chain. She found MacPhail at the museum cafe after the exhibition. The historian was there by coincidence. She had flown over for a series of academic meetings and had come to the exhibition on the same day, and Galloway, who had told neither of them about the other's presence, had apparently mentioned to MacPhail that Nora might be attending this week. MacPhail had the expression of a person who had not quite planned to orchestrate something, but was not entirely surprised to find it orchestrated. They sat with coffee and didn't speak for a moment, which was comfortable in the way that silences between people who had been through something together were comfortable, not empty, but full of the shared thing, which didn't require words to remain present. The exhibition is good, Nora said. It's better than good, MacPhail said. The curatorial team understood what they were working with. They didn't treat it as an art discovery. They treated it as a human story. That's what it is. Yes, but institutions don't always see it that way. MacPhail wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I've had 2 calls this week from families whose ancestors were cleared from the same region as the families Finley worked with. Families that are not connected to any of the objects in the chamber. They lost what they lost, and it's gone, but who want to be part of the acknowledgement, who want their history recognized in connection with this story, because this story is also their story. Nora thought about that. The exhibition had done something she hadn't fully anticipated. It had made the clearances visible in a new way by showing what one man had done in response to them. And visibility of that kind had a way of pulling more visibility toward it, of opening a space where other things that had been kept quiet could speak. "What will you do with those calls?" she asked. "I'll listen," MacPhail said simply. "That's what I've always done. Listen and record and make sure the record doesn't disappear." The afternoon light coming through the cafe windows was the low, flat light of Northern European October, and it lay across the table between them with a particular honesty that Nora appreciated. MacPhail's face in that light was the face of someone who had been doing important work for a long time with the patient attention that important work required, and who was not tired of it. "I've been asked to write a book," MacPhail said. "A popular history. Not an academic text, a book for general readers, about Finley, the clearances, the vault, the families. The full story." "Are you going to?" "Yes. I've already started." A pause. "I'd like to include your account of the discovery. First person, in your own words. Not the 400 words, those belong to the museum wall now. Something more. The experience of it, the year of it, what it changed." Nora looked at the table for a moment. "I'm not a writer. You wrote 400 words that are on the wall of the Rijksmuseum in front of a Van der Weyden. That's not evidence of writing ability. That's evidence of having something specific to say." "That's exactly what writing is," MacPhail said, with the firmness of someone who had thought about the question for a long time. Nora was quiet. Outside the cafe window, Amsterdam moved through its afternoon in its usual unhurried way, cyclists and pedestrians navigating the same spaces with the cooperative attention of people who had been doing it long enough that it had become instinctive. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for the rest of her time in Amsterdam, which was 3 more days. She went back to the exhibition on her second day, alone in the morning before the crowds built, and walked through it again more slowly, reading everything, looking at every object, standing in front of each of the pieces whose families she knew the watercolor studies, displayed with a note that the originals had been returned to the descendants of their original owner, the carved ivory figure, photographed in its new home on a shelf in a house in Inverness where its new owners had placed it, deliberately in a window where the light found it every morning. The Van der Weyden for another long, patient 20 minutes. On the 3rd day, she walked along the canal near her hotel in the morning, when it was still too early for much traffic, and the water was very still and the light was beginning, and she thought about MacPhail's offer with the seriousness it deserved. What held her back was not modesty exactly. It was a more specific concern, that writing about the discovery from her own perspective would necessarily make it about her, and the story was not about her. The story was about Finley, about the families, about the 47 objects and the 140 years they had waited and the people who had received them. She was the instrument of the recovery, not its subject. She had walked the right path and looked at the right angle and gone down the stairs. That was her role. It was a real role. She wasn't dismissing it, but it was not the center of the story. She sat on a bench by the canal with her hands in her pockets and thought about this distinction carefully, the way she thought about everything, without rushing toward a conclusion before the ground was firm enough to support one. And then she thought about the table, the detail on the legs. Finley making something beautiful in a place where no one would see it. The manner of a thing is its meaning. He had not made the table beautiful in order to be seen making it beautiful. He had made it beautiful because the work deserved to be done with that kind of attention, and the kind of attention you brought to your work was a statement about what you understood the work to be. If she wrote about the discovery honestly, not as a story about herself, but as an account of paying attention, of what happened when you moved through a landscape with the quality of observation that the landscape required, that would not make it about her. It would make it about the kind of seeing that the mountain had required and rewarded. And there was something worth saying about that. Not for her own sake, but because Finley had built the vault in a particular way, had cut the staircase as a spiral, had put detail on the table legs, and the person who found it should find it in a particular way too. with the same quality of attention that had built it. And if she could describe that quality, clearly and honestly, it might be worth reading. She called MacPhail from the bench by the canal and told her she would write the account. MacPhail was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Take as long as you need. Write it the way you write your site warden reports, factually, specifically, without embellishment. And then read it back and ask yourself whether what you've written is also true in the other sense. The sense that matters." Nora flew home the next morning. She landed in Billings in the early afternoon and drove north through country that was already deeper into autumn than Amsterdam had been. The grasses in the valleys the pale gold of dried things, the mountains carrying their first permanent snow on the upper faces. She drove with the window cracked the way she always did when she came back from somewhere, letting the air of this specific place come in and re-establish itself as the air she breathed, the particular cold, clean pine-stone quality of it that she had never been able to adequately describe to anyone who hadn't experienced it. She was home by evening. She made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table with MacPhail's latest batch of journal translations beside her, and she read while she ate, and the mountains were dark outside the window, and everything was as it always was, which was another way of saying it was exactly right. The account she wrote took 2 months. She worked on it in the evenings and on her days off, longhand first in a notebook and then typed, revising with the patience she had given to the site warden reports, but aiming for the other kind of accuracy that MacPhail had described. She wrote about the morning of the discovery and the quality of the light and the straight line that didn't belong. She wrote about the smell of the chamber and the worn centers of the spiral steps and the stone table with the detail on the legs. She wrote about Agnes Sutherland and the watercolor and the steadiness of that voice saying that's the bay. She wrote about the bay itself, in Scotland, where she had stood on the eroded headland and looked at the water that the paintings had recorded before it changed. She wrote about Finlay, not as a historical figure at a distance, but as someone she had come to know through his words and his work, through the evidence of his hands on the stone and the evidence of his mind in the journal. She wrote about what it meant to her to understand that someone had done this, had seen clearly what was being lost, and had done something about it, carefully and without shortcuts, and with full attention to how the thing was done as well as to the doing of it. She wrote about the manner of a thing being its meaning. She put that at the center of the account because it was the center of what she understood, the thing that connected the spiral staircase and the detail on the table legs and the oilcloth wrappings and the layered mortar repairs, and all of it, the understanding that how you did something was a statement about what you thought the something was worth. She sent the account to MacPhail in December, a week before the winter solstice, when the snow was deep and the hollow was inaccessible except on skis or snowshoes, which was how she accessed it now that the warmer months were over. She still went weekly. She still held the key. The site warden duties had been officially scaled back as the landmark designation was finalized, but she had not given them up, and no one had asked her to. MacPhail read the account and called her 2 days later. "It's right," the historian said. "It says what it needs to say and nothing more." "It's a bit long," Nora said. "It's exactly the right length for what it contains." "That's not the same as long." She accepted that. It sounded like something Finlay might have said, in the precise, restrained way he had of making a statement that was both practical and larger than its occasion. The book was published the following autumn, 2 years after the discovery. MacPhail's title was plain and accurate, the kind of title that told you exactly what you were getting and trusted the content to do the rest of the work: The Hollow Mountain, Charles Monroe Finlay, and the Vault of the Clarences. The cover was a photograph of the stone arch taken from the hollow on a winter morning, the snow pressing in from both sides, the dark interior of the arch a suggestion of depth rather than a revelation. Nora had taken the photograph herself, on one of her early morning visits, with the camera she carried on patrol. She had not expected the book to find many readers outside the academic and museum communities that had been following the story since the discovery. She had been wrong about that. The story had stayed in the world's attention in the way that certain stories did, not because of their spectacle, but because of their humanity, because they answered something in the people who encountered them, some need for evidence that goodness was possible and that beauty was worth protecting and that the things people cared about most could, sometimes, survive the forces arrayed against them. The legal process had concluded by the time the book was published, with a settlement that Nora thought Finlay would have recognized as right. even if it fell short of the clean resolution that the story deserved in some abstract ideal sense. 29 of the 47 objects had been returned to families whose claims had been established through the combination of MacPhail's oral history research, the agreements found in the chamber, and the genealogical work done by a team of researchers that the State Historical Society had funded specifically for the purpose. 11 had gone into public museum collections in the United States and the United Kingdom, including the Van der Weyden. The remaining 7 were still in the legal process, their claims complex enough that the resolution would take additional years, but the framework was in place, and everyone involved understood the direction. No one had profited from the discovery in the ordinary sense. There had been no finder's fee, no auction, no private sale. The objects had been treated as what they were, held in trust, belonging to their histories more than to any present-day owner. The legal teams had worked within a framework that MacPhail had helped articulate and that Galloway had championed, a framework that treated provenance as a moral as well as a legal question, and that framework had held. Nora had been asked, at various points in the legal process, whether she had any claim of her own. She had said no each time with the same directness she brought to everything. She had found the objects. She had protected them. That was what her job was. The job came with a salary and a pension and 11 years of walking the mountains, which was payment of a kind that she understood and that she would not have traded for any other consideration. The book was reviewed in papers on 4 continents. It was translated into 7 languages. A documentary was made, a careful one that MacPhail had significant creative input into, and that Nora had agreed to appear in briefly, on the condition that her segment was filmed at the Hollow and consisted of her descending the spiral staircase, without narration. The filmmaker had agreed and had shot it in a single take on a morning in early spring, the light in the Hollow exactly right, and the footage was the most watched segment of the documentary, 53 seconds of a woman descending a stone staircase in silence, one hand trailing the wall. She had not watched her own segment when the documentary first aired. She had been on patrol, deliberately, because she had not wanted to sit in her cabin watching herself descend a staircase and be required to have feelings about it in real time. She watched it 3 days later, alone, on her laptop at the kitchen table, with the sound low. 53 seconds. One hand on the wall, the spiral carrying her downward and out of the frame. She watched it twice and then closed the laptop and sat with her tea and thought that the filmmaker had understood exactly what the staircase was, not a dramatic set piece, not a visual symbol, but simply a thing that existed in the world and that you descended with your body, step by step, your hand learning the wall. The silence of the footage was not an artistic choice, but an accurate record. There had been no sound worth adding. The staircase was its own statement. The documentary reached places she hadn't expected, in the way that things did when they found the frequency of something true. It was shared in communities she had no connection to, watched by people who came to it from angles she could not have predicted: historians, artists, families with their own histories of displacement, people who had simply stumbled across it and stayed. The museum in Amsterdam reported a significant increase in attendance in the weeks following the documentary's release, particularly among younger visitors, and the guided access program at the Hollow had a waiting list that stretched 3 months out by the following spring. The messages that arrived after the documentary aired were the kind that Nora read and then sat with for a while before responding. People wrote from places she had never been, describing what the story had meant to them. A woman from a family displaced by a different historical upheaval on a different continent, writing that she recognized in Finley's work the same impulse she had seen in her own grandparents: the refusal to let the important things be taken, even when everything else was. A man whose family had survived a war by burying their most treasured possessions in a field behind their house, and who had written that he had always thought of that act as small and local, and who now understood it as belonging to a larger human category, the category of people who understood what was worth keeping and kept it. A young woman in her teens, living far from any museum or art institution, writing that the story had given her a way to think about beauty that she had not had before, not as something owned or displayed or valued by wealth, but as something kept, something passed forward. Nora answered every message personally. It took considerable time. She did it in the evenings, at the kitchen table, with the same attention she brought to the site warden reports and the account for MacPhail's book. She thought of it as part of the work that Finley had not been able to do himself, since the whole point of his work had been that the people he was doing it for were not yet born when he did it. She was answering one of those messages on a Tuesday evening in October, 2 years after the discovery, when she looked up from the laptop and out the window at the ridgeline and registered that the aspens had turned again. The gold of them exact and unhurried, the same as every year, the same as it had been on the afternoon she had come home from the hollow with the weight of the discovery newly settled in her chest, and had sat at this same table and thought about a man who had put detail on a table's legs in a sealed chamber. 2 years. Every object accounted for. Every family that could be found had been found. The Van der Weyden hung in Amsterdam. The watercolor of the bay was in Scotland, in the home of Agnes Sutherland's daughter, displayed in a window, so the morning light found it. The carved ivory figures were in museums where they could be seen by anyone. The illuminated manuscript page was in a conservation collection at the University of Edinburgh, its gold leaf still catching the light the way it had in the 12th century when someone had decided this thing was worth the time it took to make it beautiful. The chamber was a designated historical landmark with interpretive materials and a guided access program that MacPhail had helped design, built around the principle that people who visited should understand not just what was found there, but why it had been built there, by whom, and at what cost. The spiral staircase was open to visitors in small guided groups. The stone table was preserved in situ. The shelves stood as they were, empty but labeled, each empty space named for what had rested there and where it had gone. Nora still held a key. She went down on the anniversary, alone before the site opened for the day. The hollow was the same. October light, the particular quality of it. The stone arch precise and patient. She unlocked the padlock and descended the spiral staircase in the dark, one hand on the wall, counting steps by feel. She had counted them so many times the number had become part of her, the way certain things became part of you when you had done them with full attention over a long enough time. At the bottom she turned on her light and stood in the chamber of Charles Monroe Finley's making. The empty shelves, the stone table, the iron keys in their metal box, still unmatched to any lock, still keeping whatever small private secret Finley had decided not to explain. The leveled floor with its tool marks, the patience of the labor that had made it. The walls where worked stone met native rock, the seam between the built thing and the given thing, the collaboration between a builder's knowledge and a mountain's character. The guided access program had brought several hundred visitors through the chamber over the past year. Nora had led some of those visits herself, when her schedule allowed, because she had found that she was good at it in a way she hadn't anticipated, not as a lecturer, not as a storyteller in any performed sense, but as a person who could stand in a place that mattered and let it speak by staying quiet long enough for people to hear it. She did not tell visitors what to feel. She showed them the tool marks and the mortar repairs and the detail on the table legs, and she let those things be what they were, and she watched people understand them. Understanding was visible. She had learned to recognize it not on every face, not in every visitor, but in the ones who had come ready to pay the right kind of attention. It showed in the way they stopped moving, in the way they looked, in the particular quality of stillness that the chamber produced in people who were genuinely present in it. A family had come last month from Glasgow, a grandmother, her daughter, her teenage granddaughter whose connection to the clearances was general rather than specific, no documented ancestor in Finley's agreements, no object from the chamber to receive. They had come simply because the story had mattered to them, because the grandmother had read MacPhail's book and had called her daughter and had said she needed to see where it had happened. Nora had led their visit. She had watched the grandmother stand in front of the empty shelves, the section that had held the objects whose families had been found and who had taken them home, and she had watched the old woman place one hand flat against the stone of the shelf and stand there without speaking for a long time. Afterward, at the top of the staircase, in the October air, the grandmother had turned to Nora and said something in a voice that was very even and completely serious. "This is the first time in my life I have stood in a place where someone did the right thing, and it lasted." Nora had carried that sentence for weeks. She carried it still. She stood there for a while in the way she had learned to stand in places that required full presence, not performing attention, but actually paying it, letting the place be what it was and registering what it offered to someone who was genuinely there. She thought about the year Finley had built this, what the world had looked like from where he stood, what it cost to see clearly what was being lost, and to respond not with grief alone, though grief must have been part of it, a constant presence in the work, but with action. Specific, practical, beautiful action. She had thought about this distinction many times over the past 2 years, the distinction between grief and response, because it seemed to her an important one and not always clearly made. Grief was what the situation deserved, but grief alone was not enough. Grief left the things that mattered vulnerable to the same forces that had threatened them in the first place. Response was different. Response was the spiral staircase and the leveled floor and the oilcloth wrappings applied with care and the mortar repaired season after season and the journal kept in the precise hand of a man who understood that the record of a thing was part of the thing. Response was the decision to make the table beautiful even in a sealed room where no one would see it, because the manner of the work was its meaning, and you did not get to maintain the meaning while cutting corners on the manner. She had tried to apply this understanding to her own work in the 2 years since the discovery, with mixed results and considerable ongoing effort. It was easier to understand as a principle than to live as a practice. There were days when the site warden duties were tedious and the paperwork accumulated and the patrol routes were routine to the point of monotony. And on those days the quality of attention she wanted to bring was harder to summon than on the days when the light was right and the landscape was saying something clear. But she had the staircase to think about. She had the detail on the legs of the table. She had Finley's letter. The work is finished. What was entrusted to me is safe. I am content. She had the grandmother's voice saying, "This is the first time in my life I have stood in a place where someone did the right thing and it lasted." Those things were enough to keep going on the difficult days. They were the equivalent of the mortar repairs, the small, unglamorous maintenance of something that mattered, done not for recognition, but because the thing required it, and you were the one present to do it. She thought about the families, about Agnes Sutherland and the bay in the watercolor, about the man in Inverness whose grandmother had told him stories of a painting left behind, who had driven to Montana in a rented car and descended the spiral staircase and received, with both hands, a carved ivory figure that was older than any written record his family had kept. About the woman in Nova Scotia who had sent a photograph of the painting now hanging in her living room, not a famous painting, not worth anything in market terms, a landscape by an unknown hand, depicting a hillside that no longer existed in that form, with a note that said simply, "We kept looking at an empty wall for 150 years. Now the wall is not empty." That note was on Nora's refrigerator, held there by a plain magnet, next to a photograph of the hollow in winter and a postcard of the Van der Weyden from the Rijksmuseum. She looked at them every morning. They were a reasonable account of what the work had been and what it had meant, and she did not need more than that. She turned off her light. She stood in the complete dark of the chamber for a moment and let it be complete. The cold of the mountain rock, the smell of sealed stone, the silence, which was not empty but full of time, full of what had been kept here, full of the long patience of a man who had understood that the right thing to do was also the hard thing to do and had done it anyway, beautifully, without an audience, because the manner of a thing was its meaning and no other accounting was required. She climbed the spiral staircase in the dark, one hand on the wall, counting the steps she didn't need to count. She came up through the stone arch into the October morning, and the light hit her face, and the hollow was exactly itself. The meadow faded now to its autumn palette, the ridgelines sharp against a sky that had decided, as it always did in October, to be fully and unapologetically blue. She locked the padlock. She wrote the visit in her log. She stood for a moment in front of the arch and looked at the worked stone and the keystone that Finley had set with his own hands, and she thought, "Thank you for building it the way you built it, for doing it the way you did it, for understanding that the manner was the meaning and holding to that understanding through everything the work cost you." She walked back up the slope to the service road. The aspens were gold above the hollow, the same gold as every year. The mountains held their silence the way they always held it, with the indifference of things that had been here longer than the idea of time, and would be here after the last person who remembered this story was gone. But the story was in the record now, in the journal translations and MacPhail's book and the exhibition wall in Amsterdam, and the 53 seconds of footage of a woman descending a staircase in silence, and records were what people had instead of permanence, and they were enough, when they were kept carefully, to carry the important things forward. She got into her truck and drove toward the park boundary and her day's work, through the gold and the blue of an October that was exactly like every other October, and also, as every October was, completely itself. She had a patrol to run. She had trails to check and markers to document, and snowpack to measure, and the ordinary work of keeping a place known and accounted for. She would do it with the same attention she always brought to it, which was the same attention Finley had brought to his work, which was the attention that things worth doing required. She had learned, in 2 years of being the person who had found the hollow mountain, that the discovery was not the thing. The discovery was a moment, a single morning, a straight line in the snow at the right angle in the right light. What mattered was everything that came before and after. The 11 years of walking carefully, the daily discipline of looking at a landscape as if it had something to say and being willing to slow down long enough to hear it. The years of documentation and testimony and legal process and careful archaeological work that had followed. The families receiving what had been kept for them. The grandmother's hand flat against the empty shelf. The discovery had required a particular quality of attention, but so did every day of the work. So did the mortar repairs. So did the account for MacPhail's book and the messages answered one by one at the kitchen table, and the 53 seconds of a staircase descended in silence. The manner was always the meaning. There was no version of the work where that stopped being true. She drove. The mountains kept pace alongside her, as they always did. The aspens were burning gold in the morning light, unambiguous, stating their October fact with the confidence of things that had been making the same statement every year for longer than anyone was alive to count. The work was good. The work was enough. The world contained people who had built things in the dark for the sake of those who would come after them. And the world also contained people who walked carefully enough to find what had been built, and between those two kinds of people, the important things survived. She turned onto the patrol road, and the hollow fell away behind her, and the mountains opened ahead, and she drove into the day with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the landscape, and her full attention exactly where it needed to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.